This conference will now be recorded.
Good morning, class. I do apologize for not being able to meet with you all on Friday night. Again, I sent you an email regarding that. So what I wanted to do was take time this morning. I haven't been able to do it over the weekend. I did grade your tests, and so they have been posted for test number 3. But here this morning, we're going to talk about and discuss part 2 of chapter 10's notes, and in particular talking about the spinal cord and reflexes. So let's begin, and we'll share some images and such that I'm going to post in documents and resources. All right, so let's here we go. So let's start off with the spinal cord and see here as far as what's going on as far as structural anatomy, and also let's take a look at an image before we move on. Let's do that. Yeah. So I'd like to take a look at this image first. And what we're looking at here and seeing is that I wanted to show you this image so that you see how really small the spinal cord is. The spinal cord resides within the foramen here, okay, and vertebral foramen. And we're not talking about the intervertebral foramen, which would be between created by the vertebra above and below and allowing for these nerve roots, right, to pass through. We're not talking about that. We're talking about the vertebral foramen, where the spinal cord resides, and you'll see how small it is in comparison to the vertebra. Here's the vertebral body, and here we have the posterior aspect. So this would be the spinous process, and so this would be dorsal or posterior. Here would be anterior, right? So as we're looking at the spinal cord anatomy, now let's look at another image. I like showing you that one there just so that you can see in relationship to the spine itself. So here, this is a very good image. And so what you're seeing here, folks, is that we have the dorsal aspect or the posterior aspect, and we have the ventral aspect or the anterior aspect of the cord, okay? So cord anatomy. And here we're looking at as far as these structures right here, the dorsal root ganglion, the ventral root right here, will form the spinal nerve, okay? That spinal nerves, there are pairs of spinal nerves, 31 pairs, and they are bilateral. They're on both sides, exit off of the spine and off of the spinal cord and through the spine, through that intervertebral foramen, that hole created again by the vertebra above and below. And we've seen that all in the lab. And here you're seeing that these are going to go to different areas of the body, and we're going to discuss that a little bit later. So here you're seeing that as far as sensory input enters in through the dorsal root, okay? And here's the ganglion, here's the dorsal root. Again, this is peripheral nervous system. What is this? Central nervous system. So a group of nuclei in the nuclei present within the peripheral nervous system, ganglia or ganglion, right? In the central nervous system, nuclei, right? So nucleus, nuclei. So again, central nervous system, spinal cord. And you'll see here that the gray matter and the white matter, okay? So the gray matter, right? We're talking about unmyelinated portions of the central nervous system. The white matter, all in through here that I'm highlighting, right? This would be white matter. This would be the area of the nervous system that is actually myelination is present, okay? And that protective insulating covering. And so we've talked about that as far as within the central nervous system, as far as the oligodendrocytes create the myelin. In the peripheral nervous system, the Schwann cells create the myelin, okay? Remember that. It's very important. And you'll see again here that, again, sensory input coming to the central nervous system by the dorsal root and passing through the dorsal ganglion, dorsal root. And here we have ventral output, right? This would be motor output, efferent signals. You need to remember these terms, afferent and efferent. So this motor output from the central nervous system passes via the ventral root, okay? And so very important, folks, to remember sensory input, motor output, sensory input through the dorsal root, motor output through the ventral root. And that sensory input is afferent, that motor output is efferent, E-F-F-E-R-E-N-T, okay? So this is a really good image. So again, I'll post these images for you in documents and resources, okay? And you'll let's see here. Let's move out of that one. Let's go to our, And this one also just a more of a simplistic image, but again, just helping you to see a little bit more as far as, again, the sensory input, the motor output, okay? And seeing here the actual spinal nerve itself, folks, right? Okay, let's get back into then we see here as far as the spinal cord. So it begins at the foramen magnum. So we know what the foramen magnum is, that very large hole, right? Extends to the level of L1, L2, right? There is a little bit of difference, anatomical differences between people. That point of termination at L1, L2, it's called the conus medullaris, right? The filum terminal, this is what actually extends from the spinal cord and helps to anchor the cord to the coccyx, the tailbone, right? And then we have the cauda equina, excuse me, the collection of nerve roots at the end of the vertebral column. And so really when you have what's passing through that vertebral foramen from L1, L2 distal, right? This would be the cauda equina, okay? 31 pairs of spinal nerves. So we know that there are 12 pairs of cranial nerves, and we'll discuss them in next chapter. 31 pairs of spinal nerves. And again, they're pairs, they're bilateral, okay? You'll see here that there's a cervical and a lumbosacral enlargement, and this just helps to serve the upper and lower extremities, right? Now, as I'm going to pull up this image again, and I just want to show you this image regarding the cord, okay? And so again, we talked about white matter, we talked about gray matter, okay? So in the central nervous system, the brain is opposite. The gray matter would be the outer portion, the white matter would be the inner portion, which pockets also of gray matter, but really gray outer, white matter inner. For the brain, for the spinal cord, it's opposite. Gray matter is inner, the white matter is outer. Okay, so you need to remember that. Okay, so as far as the white matter, large numbers of myelinated and unmyelinated axons, but primarily there's myelinated axons, hence the term white matter. The gray matter, right? This is what forms that butterfly or H shape, depending upon where you are on the cord, and dominated by neuron cell bodies, as well as neuroglia, support cells, and unmyelinated axons. Okay. So the spinal nerve, right? So the spinal nerve, unlike the cranial nerves can either be sensory, motor, or both. In the case of the spinal nerve, they are, we could say, mixed nerves, or both. They contain both sensory and motor neurons, okay, for the spinal nerves. But again, cranial nerves can be either just only sensory, only motor, or a combination of the two, mixed or both containing, okay? So that's different from the cranial. The cranial nerves are different from the spinal nerves. Now you'll see here as far as connective tissue coverings, very similar to and analogous to when we looked at as far as the muscles are concerned in skeletal muscle anatomy, and seeing that there are these connective tissue coverings. So let's take a look at that. Also, here we go with this image right here. And you'll see that as far as the spinal nerve is concerned, it is covered in the epineurium, right? So covering the entire nerve is the epineurium. The fascicle containing the axons, right? So the nerve is composed of fascicles, right? And this fascicle is composed of axons. Well, the fascicle itself is covered in perineurium, and then these individual axons are covered in endoneurium. Okay. Now we're not talking about, again, the insulation as far as for whether they're myelinated or unmyelinated. That's not here. Connective tissue is what we're talking about, connective tissue protection of the nervous system structures. So again, I'll post this for you all. Okay. You'll see here as far as a little bit more discussion regarding gray matter, and seeing that there is a posterior horn, or you can also call this the dorsal horn, lateral and anterior, or we can call this the visceral horn. Okay, and so posterior, right? So we're having sensory input, and then that's dorsal horn or posterior horn. Anterior horn, or the we would say the ventral horn, would be the motor output. Okay. You'll see here also, as far as in the central nervous system, we say groups of cell bodies are nuclei, right? And so there are sensory and motor nuclei. As far as white matter is concerned, and you didn't see it on this image here, and I didn't post it on this. Yeah, I didn't post an image for that. But know that in the white matter, know that in the white matter, there are these columns, okay, these columns and these tracks. So when you think of a nerve present within the peripheral nervous system, right? This is an axon and such, but when we talk about a nerve analogous to a nerve in the central nervous system, we talk about tracks. And we talk about tracks that are either ascending, carrying sensory input, or descending, carrying motor output, right? From the brain through the cord and out to the peripheral nervous system. So the term nerve plexus, right? The nerve plexus. And so you'll need to know this, folks, as far as that. So plexus representing braid, right? And so think about this. This is quite interesting how we have these multiple nerves that are present that are in a group. Okay, a plexus, a group, a braid of these nerves. Originally occurred during development as different ventral rami, innervating small skeletal muscles. Then later the muscles fuse to form larger muscles with compound origins. So the ventral rami remain and blend fibers to form these plexuses. And so understand that we have the cervical plexus, which combines the spinal nerves of C1 through C4, the brachial plexus from C5 to T1. And so damage to the brachial plexus, can there be impingement in the cervical region, right? That can affect what goes on as far as numbness and tingling and weak musculature on one side, if it's only on one side, right? That can cause that kind of like paresthesia, that type of pins and needles type sensation as a result of impingement of these nerves can affect the upper extremity. And also, when we think of impingement in lumbar and sacral plexuses, plexi, right? Both those regions there, can there be, so it's a bulging disc. So a bulging disc in the brachial plexus of C5 through T1, can that affect what's going on as far as pressure upon the nerve itself that's passing through and going to the upper extremity? Or in the case of the lower extremity, in the lumbar or sacral plexus, can we have a bulging disc that can be prominent more on one side? Or how about, can we have a bulging disc that goes centrally located and it's affecting the cord contents going to bilateral to both extremities? That's really not fun and very more complex to treat and such. And so they can, and so through chiropractic care, we work with and have done work with patients who have disc bulge, some minor disc bulges and impingement of nerves and such, and musculature that's spasming and not functioning properly. You know, these are the things that we would work with as far as with modalities, different types of things from either laser therapy to ultrasound to muscle stimulation to chiropractic adjustments. You would know them as manipulations to the spine and such, and can help take pressure off and help return function, and as a result, diminish or even reduce quite dramatically or altogether help with, over time, pain and discomfort. There also can be surgical interventions that can be done, and laminectomies and discectomies and removal of bulging tissue. That is, again, those are much more risky than the other route, but at times that can be a needed intervention for the patient. But we always go to the route of more of non-invasive before we enter into the invasive procedures. And also physical therapy can be helpful also, folks, right? So, you know, all working together as far as a team trying to help patients that deal with these pain and discomfort and lack of range of, reduced range of motion and weak musculature as a result of impingement and pressure upon nerves. Very important. Let's see here, as far as the reflex arcs are concerned, so a basic reflex arc, so you should memorize this, absolutely. I mean, this is all important for you to understand and know. That's why I put this in the notes, but understand that there needs to be some sensory information coming to the spinal cord, okay? So understand that reflexes are something that happen very quickly, and you're not thinking about it. You do something and your body will automatically react with this reflex in order to protect the body, protect one aspect of the body. So you'll see here that there's a sensory receptor. Then that sensory receptor will send information to the central nervous system via the sensory neuron. In the central nervous system, there will be an integration of this information. In turn, there will be a motor neuron that will carry information to the effector, right? In particular, the skeletal muscle we're talking about here. And this will carry efferent information. This is information that is going motor output to the peripheral nervous system and then to the periphery, to the body itself. And so you'll see here, folks, that so this is important. So receptor and effector. So we're receiving, and then there's some type of output. So receptor, sensory neuron, integration, motor neuron, effector. Pretty simplistic, folks, not too difficult. But then we get into a little bit more of a challenge as far as seeing what's taking place with these different reflexes and such. So the stretch reflex. So you see here that the patellar reflex, you all are familiar with this, and we'll talk about this again. We'll review this in class, and I'll review as far as what the patellar reflex looks like, but how you can stimulate it and such. And it's a stretch reflex, folks. So it's the best known monosynaptic reflex. Provides autonomic regulation of the skeletal muscle length, and it really is there to protect the musculature. So here we go. So the steps for the patellar reflex. So the arrival of the stimulus and the activation of the receptor, because that's the key issue there is the receptor has to be activated, okay? And so the patellar tendon is tapped by a physician or a clinician, right? So because we have, nurse practitioners, we have physician's assistants, right? A medical assistant wouldn't do this, but a clinician would do this, okay? The quadriceps tendon receptors stretch, okay? And so what's going on, folks, is that really what's happening is that the quadriceps, right? So we have the vastus medialis, vastus lateralis, vastus intermedius, as well as the rectus femoris. That's the quadriceps, right? Those four musculature, the four muscles. That tendon is stretched. So then there's an activation of the sensory neuron, because what happens then, so the reflex, the receptor is activated, and then it has to send a signal. So that signal carries via the sensory neuron to what? To the dorsal root, right? And to the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. It's that posterior aspect of the cord, the dorsal region that is activated and sent information to. That's the sensory input. Then processing takes place within the central nervous system. And no, like so even if you had your eyes closed and the clinician did this reflex to you, you would feel it, right? But you would feel it after the fact of actually your lower leg moving, right? As a result of that patellar reflex, right? So there's extension of the lower leg as a result of the patellar reflex. And so it's just very similar to the withdrawal reflex, right? So if I touch something hot, I quickly will remove my hand from whatever is very hot so that I don't, this is the body's protective mechanism to protect me from getting burned really bad, right? Instead of just holding on to there and go, oh, it's hot, and then I remove it. Now that's ridiculous, right? It's just it's a reflex. It happens very quickly. So yes, there's input going to the spinal cord, motor output from the spinal cord directly to the musculature to help me withdraw my hand from the hot object. And then after the fact, my brain is saying, whoa, that's really hot. But it's not your brain doing it, the central nervous system portion, it's your spinal cord that's actually involved in this reflex that happens very quickly. So there's an activation for the patellar reflex. Again, that stimulus activates the receptor then sends information via the sensory neuron to the dorsal region of the cord. There's processing taking place in the dorsal root, activation of the motor neuron via the then ventral horn and ventral root, and then going that motor output to then the skeletal muscles and that effector, the skeletal muscles that lead to contraction of those knee extensors of the quadriceps that we just mentioned earlier there, okay? So let's take a look and see as far as, so here's the stretch reflex here, okay? And again, I'll share these images with you all. And so what goes on with the stretch reflex is that there's a muscle spindle. This is present within the skeletal muscle, okay? And here we're looking at, instead of the knee reflex, we're looking at as far as what can take place as far as the biceps brachii, okay? And here we go, as far as fruit is being loaded into a bowl, puts weight on the arm muscles, right? There's a load that's being present and stretches it. will the bowl drop? So if someone hands me a bowl and I hold on to it, does my arm go down to the ground and not hold on to it? No. Muscle spindles in the muscle sheath are also stretched. This stretching, right, because you feel there's a little bit of a load, a little bit of a weight. The stretching stimulates these sensory receptors, these muscle spindle, that's the receptor in the muscle spindle, right? Action potentials are propagated toward the cord, right? So there's a signal. There's this sensory input going to, here's the dorsal root ganglion, here's the dorsal root, dorsal horn, right? And there's going to be integration. This is going to be information that's going to be taking place very quickly within the gray area of the spinal cord. So then we see here in the spinal cord, the axon terminals of the sensory neuron release a neurotransmitter that diffuses across a synaptic cleft and stimulates a motor neuron, right? And so what's going to happen is that the stimulation is strong enough to generate action potentials that self-propagate along the motor neuron's axon. And so know that these are myelinated, right? Because this is very, very fast input and output. Okay, very fast. Remember, we talked about 100 meters per second this can travel. Okay, so very fast. And so the motor output, so ventral horn, ventral root, right? And then here we have going to the skeletal muscle, so axon terminals of the motor neuron, synapse with the muscle fibers in the stretched muscle. Acetylcholine is released from the motor neuron's axon terminals, stimulating muscle fibers, right? Neuromuscular junction, right? The NMJ. The stimulation makes the stretched muscle contract. Ongoing stimulations and contractions hold the bowl steady. So that this way, it's not like, oh, it just drops, right? No, maybe initially if it were really heavy and you're holding it in one arm, there might be a little bit of but still it wouldn't drop to the floor. Unless the load was too heavy. Say it's 200 pounds and with one arm and all of a sudden, that would be an issue, right? But 5 pounds, right? This stretch reflex will absolutely take place, protect the musculature from being damaged, and this muscle spindle is really the receptor, the sensory receptor. Okay. Let's show you also as far as another image here. And so this is the withdrawal reflex. And so we talked about that withdrawal as far as for the hand, but how about for the foot? Say you step on a tack, right? So this is simple. So you'll see here, step on a tack, the pain fibers send signal to the spinal cord. So there's sensory input going to, so you'll see here as far as sensory input. So sensory receptor, sensory neuron, passing through the dorsal root ganglion to the dorsal root of the spinal nerve, right? 31 pairs. Here would be then the dorsal horn, okay, of the cord, the gray matter. Okay, interneurons branch to the different spinal cord segments. So here we have, as far as that's taking place within the central nervous system, motor fibers in several segments are activated. And so you'll have more than one muscle group is activated to lift the foot off of the tack, right? So that this way we have this ability to, oh, yikes, step on it. And very, very quickly, folks, there's this withdrawal. Now, I want to point out to you folks, right? So then this motor output from the ventral horn and the ventral root of the spinal nerve going to the neuromuscular junctions of the musculature in order to allow for contraction to take place very quickly. Again, myelinated fibers. Now, I want to point out one more image to you folks, and I need to pull it up here for a moment. And here we go. And so what happens, folks, and I'll demonstrate this in lab and lecture and also in talking more about it, like I said, in our review. But you'll see here that stimulation and inhibition. Well, why do we show that there as far as positive and negative? Why are we showing that? Well, understand that if one lower extremity, and this is for balance issues and such, so that you don't fall to the ground, okay, you'll see here that the right leg is going to immediately, touching something very sharp or very hot, right? You're going to reflex, right? The withdrawal reflex will allow you to contract musculature on this side in order to allow for flexion, right? Will take place here. But then what about the opposite leg? Will that also flex? And then you just both legs would go up off of the ground and you'd be like, and you drop on the ground? No, not at all. So what happens is that the opposite, so you would have then the antagonistic muscles of the other extremity. So you would have here, as far as extensors, would be contracting, allowing for stability, so that you don't just, again, flop to the ground, but you're still creating a sense of balance. And we'll talk about this in lab, but see that this is what's taking place in order to prevent you from falling. And it's just different as far as with, in particular with the lower extremities, to just show you that, you know, if one side contracts, right, the other, if one muscle group, if flexors are contracting on one side, the opposite would be extensors on the opposite extremity, okay? And in particular for lower extremity, so that you're not, right, flexors contract, and then this leg just doesn't also contract with the flexors, it contracts with the extensors, allowing for stability, allowing for a sense of balance, so that you don't fall to the ground. So this might not be an issue for a 20-year-old, but how about for somebody who's 60, 70, 80-year-old, right? And can have some type of compression fracture or hip fracture, right? So this can really, you know, be very important and save a person's body from further damage. Okay. And so you'll see here that I have, so here's the muscle spindles, the postural reflexes. So postural reflexes are very interesting as far as, so this helps you to maintain an upright posture, again, because we talked about when we were looking at and discussing skeletal muscles, and discussing that how I wouldn't, so if I'm going to pick up this pen, so I pick up this pen, all of the muscles that were being activated to pick up this pen, not all of the muscle fibers are going to be activated because it's very light. But how about this bottle of water, right? So yeah, so a few more muscle fibers would be engaged in order to pick up this water because the load is different. Or how about a 100-pound weight? With that, yeah, absolutely, right? But know this, that as far as postural muscles are concerned, right? So I'm not just sitting here like just totally like flexed and just like everything is contracted. That's ridiculous, right? But there's a level of contracture of the musculature to allow for me to sit upright, okay? And so not all the muscle fibers are contracting, but many are, in order to allow for me to maintain this upright posture. So coordinated activities of opposing muscles. So remember, we talked about antagonistic muscles. If one flexes, the other extends, right? You know, we talked about biceps brachii, triceps brachii, very easy as far as, or quadriceps and hamstrings, right? Those also antagonistic muscles. Whereas like the quadriceps, they would all be synergistic because they're all working with one action. Or the hamstrings would all be synergistic because they're working in one action. So again, you'll see here, coordinated activities of opposing muscles to keep the body's weight over the feet. Example, so leaning forward stretches calf muscle receptors, which stimulate the muscles to increase tone, and returning the body to an upright position. Postural muscles generally have firm muscle tone and extremely sensitive stretch receptors, so allow for very fine subconscious adjustments. You're not even thinking about it, folks, and it's just doing it for you. You know, your body is helping to maintain this posture. Whether you're leaning to one side or to the other, you're not just leaning and like keeling over. Now, there are other issues as far as, and we'll talk about with cardiovascular system, as far as if you're laying down and you sit up real quick, and then you feel like kind of like lightheaded and want to faint, syncope, you know, this is, yeah, we're not talking about that. We will discuss that, absolutely. We're talking about just as far as maintenance of posture and how the nervous system and the muscular system help to coordinate these subconscious, very fine adjustments of these postural muscles. And you'll see here, and I'd like you to review and look at this as far as for the withdrawal reflex with flexor and crossed extensor. So you'll see here that there is this ability for some musculature to be stimulated and some musculature to be inhibited. Because now let's go back to this image here for a moment, right here. Okay, so now, because look at this here. So we would say that like on the same leg, okay, so on the same leg, if muscles contract, so if flexors contract, we have to then inhibit the extensors, right? on that leg, right? But opposite, right? So ipsilateral, right? Ipsilateral, so same side. Contralateral, opposite side. So this gets a little bit more complex here. And actually, let me even just go to just this other image just for a moment. Yeah, so withdrawal. So know that if the muscles of the hamstrings for this image, as far as for the withdrawal reflex, and I touch something that's sharp, hot, whatever, with my lower extremity, and the muscles of the hamstrings contract, right? Allowing for what? Flexion of the lower leg. But would it make sense then that I should inhibit the extensors on that same leg, on that ipsilateral leg, right? To make sure that I don't have, because if both of them contracted, what would you have? A stiff leg, and you wouldn't be moving away from what could cause you pain and discomfort. So these muscles will be stimulated, these muscles will be inhibited on the same leg. But then go to the opposite leg, right? This leg right here, the left leg. And so we're going to have, then the opposite leg, the extensors will be contracted and the flexors will be inhibited for this left leg. That's stabilizing you. And that's the image that we were just looking at right here, right? So contralateral, so we would talk about the opposite lower extremity. Ipsilateral, we're talking about the same lower extremity. And again, on the same lower extremity, the antagonistic muscles of whatever flexing will then be inhibited. So these are stimulated, these are inhibited. And it would be the opposite for the contralateral, the other leg, the other lower extremity. And I'll review this and go over this in class, okay? Very good. So I'd like you now to, as we've been talking about this, sharing you some images with this. Then when we do get into when we do get back into lecture this week, then we can review and discuss and answer any questions. All right, folks, I appreciate you very much for being understanding, and I only wish the best for you all. And have a great day, and I hope you enjoy this brief review of the lecture notes here.